Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to the 9th and last day of the novena to Saint Dominic de Guzman. Today, we are going to reflect on the topic Saint Dominic spoke to God or spoke about God. The saints put legs on the gospel. In the past week, the Church commemorated the feasts of some of the great saints in the Church: Saint Ignatius of Loyola, Saint Alphonsus Liguri, Saint John Mary Vianney. On 8th August, we celebrate the feast of Saint Dominic, the founder of the Order of Preachers. On this last day of novena to this great saint, let us reflect earnestly on that which characterized the life and mission of Saint Dominic, speaking with God and speaking about God. A glimpse into the early sources on the life of our Holy Father, Saint Dominic, reveals not only an outstanding apostle, but an extraordinary contemplative. Many of his early disciples testified to the fact that he spoke only to God or of God, and that he dedicated his nights to prayer and worship, and his days tirelessly to souls. Saint Dominic truly possessed an apostolic heart. He was passionate about God and desired that the cause of the gospel be advanced through the teaching and preaching of truth. Saint Dominic was a man of prayer. In love with God, he had no other aspiration than the salvation of souls, especially those who had fallen into the snares of the heresies of his day. Under the Holy Spirit's guidance, he advanced along the way of Christian perfection. At each moment, prayer was the force that renewed and rendered his apostolic works increasingly fruitful. Blessed Jordan of Saxony, his successor as head of the order, writes, "During the day, no one showed himself more sociable than he. Conversely, by night, there was none more assiduous than he in keeping watch in prayer. The day he dedicated to his neighbor, but the night he gave to God." In Saint Dominic, we can see an example of the harmonious integration between contemplation of the divine mysteries and apostolic activity. According to the testimonies of the persons closest to him, he always spoke with God or of God. This observation points to his deep communion with the Lord and at the same time to his constant commitment to leading others to this communion with God. He left behind no writings on prayer, but the Dominican tradition has collected and handed on his living experience in a work titled The 9 Ways of Prayer of Saint Dominic. This book helps us to understand something of the saint's interior life, and it also helps us, as different as we are, to learn something about how to pray. According to Saint Dominic, then, there are 9 ways of prayer, and each of these, which he always carried out in the presence of Jesus crucified, express a bodily and spiritual attitude. Saint Dominic prays standing, bow down to express humility, prostrate on the ground to ask pardon for the sins, kneeling in penance to participate in the sufferings of the Lord, with arms outstretched, gazing at the crucifix to contemplate supreme love, his gaze turned towards heaven, feeling drawn to the world of God. Thus, there are 3 forms: standing, kneeling, and lying prostrate on the ground, but always with one's gaze turned to the crucified Lord. At the end of the recitation of the Liturgy of the Hours and following the celebration of the Mass, Saint Dominic prolonged his colloquy with God without placing any limits on time. Seated quietly, he would recollect himself in an attitude of listening, reading a book, or gazing upon the crucifix. He lived these moments in his relationship with God so intensely that even outwardly his reactions of joy and tears could be perceived. Thus, Through meditation, he assimilated the realities of the faith. Witnesses recount that at times he entered into a kind of ecstasy, his face transfigured, but immediately afterward he would humbly resume his daily activities, recharged by the power that came to him from above. Then there was his prayer during journeys between one friary and another. He recited Lauds, the midday hour and Vespers with his companions. And as he crossed valleys and hills, he contemplated the beauty of creation. From his heart there flowed a hymn of praise and thanksgiving to God for so many gifts, especially for the greatest wonder, the redemption wrought by Christ. Dear brothers and sisters, Saint Dominic reminds us that prayer, that personal contact with God, is at the heart and origin of the witness of faith that every Christian must give within family life, at work, in social commitments, and even in time of relaxation. Only this real relationship with God gives us the strength to live each event intensely, especially the most painful moments. Saint Dominic also reminds us of the importance of exterior attitude in our prayer, kneeling, standing before the Lord, fixing one's gaze on the crucified, pausing to recollect oneself in silence, etc. There is this need in our spiritual lives to find quiet moments for prayer each day, to have a little time to speak with God. There is no doubt that the entire life of Saint Dominic was permeated with God. The following excerpt from Embrace the Swelling Wave by Suzanne Noffke testifies to this fact. Our Holy Father walked as a holy vessel before God. It was to God that he constantly raised his sights. It was God he begged for help when in need, God to whom he prayed in spirit and in truth. To God he dedicated his heart and mind, his thoughts and desires, his body and soul. Day and night he kept before his eyes God's holiness, God's will, God's wisdom and leadership, God's love and promise, God's justice and honor. God was the treasure of his heart. His heart was filled with this treasure and his mouth overflowed with it. He preached God in word and deed. He praised God in joy and suffering. He blessed God in life and in death. God was the Father whom he admired with a childlike devotion. God was the friend of his soul, and he followed God with confidence and love. God was the first benefactor, from whose hands he received all gifts, which he then distributed among the people. God was the searching eye, before whom he felt naked and exposed, without pretense or mask. God was the judge and rewarder, from whom he expected both judgment and bliss. God was the merciful God, to whom he cried for mercy for himself and for others. God was his first and his last. God was his everything, the one to whom he prayed, out in nature and in the house of God. Outside himself and within, God was the one he praised. Loving Father Saint Dominic, intercede for us that we too may speak with God or about God.